Throughout World War II, the best of the best, the top guns of their day, were the aces of every nation. The aces, men who could claim 5 or more planes to their credit, rose to fame through their amazing exploits in aerial combat. By war's end, only 3% of all fighter pilots could claim ace status. Those 3% accounted for almost 50% of all the air-to-air victories scored between 1939 and 1945. How did they achieve such success? Clearly, an ace was a breed apart, a man who combined extraordinary flying skill with courage, keen eyesight, and savvy tactics. Those who lived through their combat experiences were usually the most calculating of all. The men who balanced risk-taking with a cool, professional understanding of their aircraft and the capabilities of the enemies. The best aces chose their tactics based on those two factors, combined with the position they found themselves in at the start of a fight. Fighter tactics in World War II underwent a radical transformation by the time VE Day brought the fighting to a close. As much as air fighting changed, however, the basic elements remained a constant. In fact, all the basic tactical foundations had long since been laid in World War I. But it took time for those lessons to be relearned once Hitler's rampage in Europe began 20 years later.
During World War I, air combat tactics evolved into two basic elements in the fighting over the Western Front. The first was the traditional swirling, turning dogfight that you see in all the World War I type air combat movies. But the Germans developed a real specialized tactic by 1918 to preserve their small fighter force on the Western Front. This was the hit-and-run tactic. They were able to dive into opposing formations, hit them, and then run away as fast as they could by high-speed dives. Well, during the 1930s, both of these elements of air-to-air combat were really lost as tacticians and theorists concluded that dogfighting was a thing of the past because of the high speeds that new fighter aircraft were capable of achieving.
The RAF was probably the most heavily influenced by that argument. Instead of focusing on air-to-air combat between fighters, it developed a wide array of rigid tactics designed to mass the firepower of a fighter formation onto bombers. Fighters in the RAF were considered interceptors, not air superiority weapons.
The mass attack tactics developed by the RAF during the interwar period proved to be an utter catastrophe during the initial stages of the Second World War. The main reason for this was the fact that when flying in these tight formations, only the squadron leader or the flight leader would actually be looking around for enemy aircraft. Everybody else was so busy flying wing on the other aircraft in the formation that they didn't have the opportunity to be looking for enemy aircraft. Consequently, they were constantly surprised and aircraft were lost that probably wouldn't have been lost had they been flying in looser formations. The other issue was the fact that taking these unwieldy, large, cumbersome formations and trying to maneuver them in a very, very fast dogfighting environment proved to be incompatible with the realities of modern air warfare.
If the RAF entered the war with deliberate and rigid tactics, the Luftwaffe took the opposite approach. The war in Spain taught the Luftwaffe to heed the lessons of World War I. They developed loose formations of 4 planes each called a swarm, with 2 plane elements called routes. They were flexible and allowed the pilots enough room so they could be looking around for enemy aircraft. As the British came up their learning curve, they gradually abandoned their pre-war tactics in favor of modified German formations. Originally, RAF squadrons flew 3-plane VICs, or Vs, where the leader flew with 2 wingmen tucked in tight behind him. By early 1941, the British had developed a 6-plane formation that was much looser and effective. It was a variation on this formation that the RAF taught to newly formed American squadrons that joined the fight against the Luftwaffe in 1942.
Basically, the British formation that we used was a box formation. A leader, a wingman behind him and slightly off to the side, element leader, and his wingman off a little bit to the side, almost a box.
From the RAF tactics that the U.S. Army Air Force inherited in North Africa and also in the early days in England, the pilots, the fighter pilots, the American fighter pilots, developed a new formation that they called the Finger Four. And it's very similar to the German Schwarm. But imagine 4 planes on the end of each finger, and each fingertip or fingernail representing the aircraft. The leader would be right here, the flight leader. His wingman is this guy right here. The element leader is here, and the element leader's wingman is in trail behind the rest of the formation back here. And the point of this formation was to fly as loose as possible while still being able to provide mutual support. And this way they could all be looking around for enemy aircraft and protect each other at the same time.
As formation styles evolved, so did the fighter pilot's knowledge of how best to employ his aircraft against the enemy. In training before the war, dogfighting had always been considered something of a one-on-one affair. Little effort was made in such encounters for a fighter formation to work as a team. Again, it was the Germans who rediscovered their roots. In Spain, they learned the distinctions between dogfighting styles, hit and run versus a turning fight. A light, agile fighter was found to be best for a turning battle, while faster aircraft with better climbing and diving characteristics proved to be the best hit-and-run style weapons.
The Germans developed the best early war hit-and-run fighter in the Messerschmitt 109. The 109 was capable of amazing vertical maneuvers and performance. And as a result, they could dive down on British formations, hit them, make a pass, and climb away with their energy that they had accumulated in the dive, and engage and disengage the British at will, and the early American pilots as well. And this sort of attack caused a lot of losses amongst Allied aircraft and aircrew during the early days and early months of the war. The only thing that the British and the American pilots in 1940, 41, 42 could do was try to break away from these diving attacks and turn. And while that was a fine defensive maneuver, it made them entirely reactive. They could not really retain the initiative or capture the initiative away from this amazing energy fighter.
Anytime you got into a jam, attacked by 109, and they were usually above us, so they'd have the initiative initially. Anytime you were attacked by a 109, about the only thing you could do to keep from getting hit was to get into a tight turn, which he couldn't keep with you. And if you could persuade him to stick with you, you could eventually get around, work into position on his tail.
The Germans could never turn with you. A 109 had a much heavier wing loading, 32 pounds versus the Spitfire's Hurricane 25. So a German would be fool enough to try and get on a tight turn with you. You'd nail him. You'd just turn inside him and shoot him. They knew that.
Occasionally, overzealous German pilots would commit a fatal error and attempt to turn fight Allied fighters. Those pilots did not live long.
I spotted a bunch of 109s came down from above us and heading down toward the targets. Well, I turned my flight up into them and tried to divert them, drive them off, which was kind of silly because there were about six or eight 109s and we were 4 P-40s at that point. At any rate, we got into a big hassle going round and round, and I wound up with 3 of them on my tail, taking turns making passes at me. And as I had mentioned earlier, when they'd get within what I estimated was firing range, why I'd go into a turn and manage to divert them that way to the point where they couldn't pull enough lead to hit me. And one of them made the mistake of trying to turn with me, and in 2 turns I got around behind him and killed him.
As the war progressed and newer American designs entered the fighting over Europe, the Germans saw the advantages they enjoyed with the Me-109 and FW-190 erode.
From about mid-1943 on, German pilot quality really began to decline. And as it declined, Allied pilot quality increased as there was more breathing room to train the pilots more effectively and more thoroughly before they went into combat. And it was that fact, combined with the new aircraft that the Allies were just beginning to deploy, that could outclass the 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, that gave the Allies the edge they needed in the skies over Europe.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was the first of the new breed. At altitude, nothing could beat a Thunderbolt if flown by a skilled pilot. Though normally considered a hit-and-run or energy fighter due to its terrific diving abilities, in the hands of a skilled pilot, the P-47D and M models could tackle any Luftwaffe fighter in any type of dogfight. With a fighter capable of both styles of air combat, the tactical situation usually dictated how the fight would develop. Whoever had altitude advantage generally initiated the fight and would attempt to keep the engagement vertical using hit-and-run strategies. At low altitudes, energy fighters were at a distinct disadvantage. If caught low and slow, they could be chewed up by turn fights where they would have no escape. Fortunately, the P-47 in skilled hands proved to be a more than capable all-around fighter, even in a low-altitude turning fight.
We were on the deck, working on the deck, and I think we could outfly him on the deck. He couldn't get away from me. I could turn in and keep right with him, and so I just had him going and going, and he finally decided it's better get out than to get shot down.
While the P-47 proved to be an excellent fighter aircraft, early P-38 pilots who flew against the Luftwaffe in late 1942 and 43 found themselves at a real disadvantage. Initially, many P-38 squadrons attempted to engage in turn fights with the German 109s and 190s, a disastrous mistake. Since the 109s and 190s were as fast or faster as early P-38s, the American pilots usually could not outrun their Luftwaffe counterparts unless they started a fight with an altitude advantage. Even the mid-war variants of the P-38, including the F and G models, had a particularly hard time in Europe in the escort role. Tied to the bombers, the Lightning pilots seemed to always find themselves in a disadvantageous tactical situation.
A German plane could cut off their attack any time. All they had to do was dive. A P-38, this was a bad maneuver, because if we went into a dive and followed them, we got into compressibility. At first, we couldn't pull it out of there. Compressibility is a high-speed buffet, and it's dangerous. They were up there hiding in the sun, and they'd roll over and come down at us, and for a while there, we thought the Germans were after us instead of the bombers. We couldn't outturn them, and we couldn't dive with them. It was their show there for quite a bit. We didn't get as many of them, I guess, as they got of us. We had quite a few losses.
After some painful lessons, the P-38 units learned to at least hold their own against the Luftwaffe through 1943.
When you see them coming, you turn. They didn't like the front end of a P-38, and they had respect for us. You see, they didn't know what we could do. They had to learn just like we did how well we were going to perform against them.
By the end of 1944, however, the P-38L reached units in the European theater and gave the Americans a revolutionary model of the Lightning. With its hydraulic boost controls, dive brakes to inhibit compressibility, and powerful Allison engines, the L model allowed the pilots to employ tactics that weren't available to them before.
The original P-38 was kind of stiff. You had to really put effort. 1 pound here was 1 pound out there. But after they put those hydraulic boosters on it, 1 pound here was 16 out there. And boy, we could outroll Spitfires or P-51s or any of the rest of them with aileron boosters. And so the quicker you can establish your turn and pull back on the stick means the tighter turn you can make, see? And we could outturn anybody, and then it would turn right, being so stable. Whenever a single engine plane gets down to about 91, 92 miles an hour, if you're turning to the right, and it stalls, it'll flip back over this way, out of control. P-38, you could turn it right down forever at 72 miles an hour at full power and never stall out. And getting that turn established was the main thing. Up until we got the dive flaps, every time we get in a fight with the Germans up at altitude, we could outturn them. We could really outturn them. But the minute we got inside of them, they'd just turn over and go straight for the ground, 26,000 feet or wherever you were, say. And if we chased them, we got out of control. And the P-38 wanted to tuck back under like that, and the more you pulled on it, the more it would tuck under. It was out of control. So we had to have something that would keep it from accelerating past that speed. So they invented this dive flap that was run by electric motor, and it opened like that. It took about 1 second to open and close, you know. And the minute that guy in front of you pulled that split S like that, you just pop those dive flaps and you just get right behind him. And boy, were they surprised after we got those, because they'd pull out at the bottom. 26,000 feet's not very fast to run, very far to run at 450 miles an hour, see. And when they pulled out at the bottom, there was a P-38 right on their tail, you know. And that was their big surprise. That really, dive flaps, we called them dive brakes, but they were dive flaps, that's what they were. They were really great. We could outturn them, we could outclimb them, we could outdive them, we could outlast them, and we could outgun them.
This late war version of the P-38 gave the American pilots the confidence needed to engage the Luftwaffe in nearly every conceivable tactical situation, knowing that in a pinch, they could fight their way out. Jim Byers recalls one fight that started in a most unusual way, with the Americans engaging from below.
They were above us to start with. And we was in a hole in the overcast, you know. We looked up and there they were, about 2,500 feet above us. And they were getting all queued up in an echelon. So I just took my flight right through the middle of them. And they scattered. And then we started picking them off. But none of them would fly out of that hole, see. They had to be inexperienced. We shot all 14 of them down, 11 of us. But our 11 guys accounted for over 700 missions. See, they were pretty well experienced by then, you know, see. God, there ain't no sense of letting them get the first shot, you know. And if you sit and do nothing, you get hurt. But if you make a mistake, you can change that, see. If you do something and make a mistake, you can change it. But if you just sit there and do nothing, you can't change anything.
In other situations, the P-38 could be one of the deadliest hit-and-run fighters of the war, especially if the Lightnings began a fight with altitude advantage.
When we looked off to the east, a whole bunch of ME-109s, about 20 of them, were attacking 4 P-47s. Coming down, boy, just like rain down out of the sky. So we flew over there and got in the fight, and we shot down 8 of them. All that happens fast, you know. You're scared, but you're not panicked. You know, see, that's the difference right there. Yeah, and anybody that says they aren't scared, they're useless, because anybody that is any good at all gets scared.
In 1944, when the 354th Fighter Group introduced the P-51B into Northern Europe, the tide of the air war turned decisively against the Luftwaffe. At last, the Allies possessed a long-range air superiority fighter whose capabilities matched or exceeded every enemy fighter. While the P-47's major weakness was its slow rate of climb, the Mustang climbed like a homesick angel and dived with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. With no major weaknesses, the P-51 became the best all-around air superiority fighter of the war at any altitude.
That caught the Germans flat-footed there for a while. They really gave them a bad time, because the 51s would catch the German air force in the air, and they dropped those tanks, and then they cut them to pieces because the the 51 could outturn the Messerschmitts. So they made out real well there.
By war's end, the nature of the air war had evolved into a brutal struggle for positional advantage. From the early days when the Germans were able to dominate the RAF with their sleek 109s and their deadly hit-and-run tactics, newer Allied aircraft arrived in time to change the fundamental nature of the air war. While retaining their edge in turn fights, Allied pilots enjoyed unparalleled flexibility with the late generation of fighters and could fight the Germans in vertical hit-and-run style and win. Such flexibility spelled doom for the Luftwaffe's fighter force by 1944. While different tactics could help offset the advantages an enemy may have in aircraft quality or quantity, there were some basic elements to air combat that always remained a constant. Mastering them took time, something that fighter pilots in World War II didn't always have.
During World War II, American pilots used to say, "Fly 5 and stay alive." And what that meant was, if you made 5 missions, if you flew 5 missions and you were still alive, your chances of survival through your entire tour just went up exponentially. The reason for this was something that later was called situational awareness. SA was basically the ability to process all the information going on around a pilot in the midst of an air-to-air engagement. And developing the sense of situational awareness needed for survival in air combat took time. If a pilot could fly 5 missions, he'd have the experience needed to really understand and process the things that he saw. But before that point, he had no concept of what was going on around him. Frequently, pilots never even saw aircraft around them in an air-to-air engagement, and even more seriously, they rarely saw the aircraft that shot them down. As a result, it was the inexperienced pilots that made up the brunt of losses through the entire Second World War.
Dogfights are funny things. They're huge. They might go all over the sky. You lose track of your own people. Hopefully your wingman stays with you. If he doesn't, then you're in trouble, because you not only have to watch what you're doing, you have to watch behind you. People who don't check 6 are in deep trouble. If they won't be victor, they'll be victim.
Sighting the enemy has remained the single most important element to winning any air-to-air engagement. Once the enemy had been sighted, keeping them in sight was always critical to winning the battle. Another fighter pilot proverb of the day ran, "Lose sight, lose the fight." Without knowing what the enemy was attempting next, a fighter pilot could not select the maneuver needed to counter it. Again, that was why so many inexperienced pilots went down. They simply could not see or process all the information unfolding around them. Sometimes, if a pilot lost sight of the friendly aircraft in his flight or squadron, they could be almost as hazardous as the enemies in close-range turn fights.
One of my very first sightings of an enemy aircraft was a 109 who crossed in front of me. I turned and got headed towards him in a steep bank left, and all of a sudden he started coming apart, and I hadn't fired my guns yet, and it was Glenn Eagleston coming in from the other side had hit him. Glenn used to tell me all the time, "I owe you one." He says, we almost were air scoop to air scoop when he finally hit him.
If a fighter pilot could stay alive long enough to learn some of the key lessons in air combat survival, he could become a very valuable asset to his squadron.
During the war, to be a successful fighter pilot in air-to-air combat, you needed a couple of basic ingredients. The first was eyesight. A successful fighter pilot had good eyesight and could spot enemy aircraft at long ranges. The second was the ability to fly his aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope. Basically, he needed to be a good pilot. And kind of as a corollary to that, he needed to understand his aircraft as thoroughly as possible so he could get the most out of it. And that really came down to a number of hours that particular pilot had flown in the fighter type he was taking into combat. Lastly, he needed to have a thorough understanding of the tactics that would maximize his aircraft's potential and capabilities in air-to-air combat, while at the same time negating some of the advantages the enemy aircraft possessed over his own aircraft.
Air-to-air gunnery was and still is a true art form that only a select few ever really master. Dick Bong, America's ace of aces, spent his first months in combat unable to hit anything except from practically dead astern. Later, after undergoing extensive gunnery training in the States, he returned to combat and became an incredible aerial marksman, hitting targets from virtually any deflection.
Deflection shooting was the ability to take out a target from different angles relative to that particular target's direction. So firing from directly astern on an enemy plane was called a zero-degree deflection shot, while shooting from a 45-degree angle from behind was called a 45-degree deflection shot. The most difficult shot was the 90-degree deflection shot, where the shooting plane was perpendicular to the target aircraft. That required the most amount of lead and the most amount of calculations in the pilot's head to actually hit the target. Deflection shooting was actually an art form. It was very difficult to do, and there were very few pilots who were really good enough to hit a target from anywhere except dead astern. So those that were able to do it really had very high scores. René Fonck was probably one of the most famous deflection shooters in aviation history. He was a World War I French ace with over 70 kills to his credit. During World War II, some of the great deflection shooters were Hans Joachim Marseille, who was a German pilot who was renowned for his ability to bring down very rugged aircraft like P-40s with 7 or 8 shots. He was that good of a marksman. For the Americans, probably one of the best deflection shooters was Tommy McGuire, who had 38 kills and was the second-ranking American ace in World War II.
Through much of the war, Americans relied on fixed reflector gun sights. At first, the standard K9 gun sight was used. Later in the war, however, the United States developed a computer gun sight known as the K-14. With the help of a gyro, it would compute the lead required to hit an aerial target.
We had a K-14 sight that was a gyro sight, and you put the pip on the plane, and if you were in too tight of a turn, though, you better have your stationary sight on too. And it happened to me, and I was pulling in a real tight turn, and the thing was gone. Just dumped. It would dump. You pull a gyro too fast, it'll dump. Then you got to shut it off and get it going again. And if I'd had my needle or ring and dot, I probably got him, but nothing I could do. So you had to be careful when you're in a real tight turn with that gyro. But it was a big improvement.
It was the rare individual indeed who could master all these complicated and demanding elements of air combat and survive long enough to get good at them. Of those who did, only a select few became true hunters, the aces. Their workplace was the vast reaches of the sky over Europe. Their job, a grim repetition of killing and survival. Losses among the top aces were always high.
Throughout aviation history, aces have always been among the most aggressive pilots in the air, but some have been more aggressive than others. And these types of aces led brilliant, if short, careers in air-to-air combat. They were the reckless of the reckless. They were the ones who would wade into any fight, no matter what the situation, no matter how heavily outnumbered, and they would fight it out. And these guys scored incredible victories in a very short span of time, but generally they fell victim to their own recklessness in the end and died at the hands of their own mistakes in air-to-air battle.
To survive in air combat took courage, skill, and lots of luck. To become a hunter instead of just a target took a healthy combination of experience, eyesight, and the proper tactics. It took all sides involved in the air war time to relearn the basic air combat lessons that emerged from World War I. But when they did, a whole host of tactical innovations transformed the air war in Europe. Bad tactics could get even the best of the best killed. Good tactics could offset nearly any advantage the enemy brought to the table, ensuring both survival and success. In 1940, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the world was saved by 2 aircraft designs and a handful of pilots. As the crushing tide of Nazism crested on the banks of the French coastline that summer, England stood alone, its allies plundered and destroyed. The Germans had won easy victories everywhere, from Poland in 1939 to the conquest of France in only 40 days a year later. In the Battle of France, England had been hit hard. Most of its army barely escaped at Dunkirk. The Royal Air Force had sent a strong contingent of squadrons to help out the French almost as soon as the war broke out. These RAF units, dubbed the Advanced Air Striking Force, were thrown into the cauldron of battle in May of 1940. In just a matter of weeks, those squadrons were all but wiped out, with a loss of over 900 planes. Even worse, many of the RAF's most experienced pilots were killed or captured during that disastrous month. Arthur Deacon, a Hurricane pilot with 242 Squadron, was one of those unlucky pilots.
When I got hit, I thought, well, if I jump, if it catches fire, I'll jump, and I put the hood back. And I undid my harness, and I was just off the Belgian coast. But gosh, if I can just get to the Belgian coast, I'll be all right. I just got to the coast, pulled back on the stick, nothing there, and I went straight in. Fortunately, I had put the hood back, undid my harness. I was catapulted out into the garden of a hospital. Once again, God said, look, I'll give you one more chance.
With so many pilots and planes lost during the French catastrophe, the Royal Air Force pleaded with Churchill not to send any more squadrons across the Channel. There were barely enough squadrons left to protect southern England, and once the Prime Minister realized the gravity of the situation, he agreed. No further units would be sent to France. Germany and its mighty blitzkrieg war machine now stood poised to conquer all of Europe. All that barred their path to total victory was the English Channel and what was left of RAF Fighter Command. With its 49 squadrons of Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires, Fighter Command would prove to be Britain's last line of defense that summer of 1940. Those 2 aircraft, the ones which would soon save England and change the course of World War II, were pre-war designs dating back to the mid-1930s. The Hawker Hurricane first flew in November of 1935 as the Royal Air Force's first monoplane fighter. Faster than any RAF airplane of the day, the Hurricane prototype exceeded 300 miles per hour in level flight. 2 years later, the Hurricane 1 entered service. Pilots quickly learned to love the new plane, both for its ruggedness and its maneuverability.
I was posted north to Carlisle to 51 OTU, Operational Training Unit, which got you ready for operations, and I flew Hurricanes there. I thought it was great. Oh, wonderful plane. There's lots of power, and it's just you, nobody else. And it was a great airplane, I thought.
It wasn't as fast as the Spit, but it was more maneuverable, and it was more solid. It was a rugged aircraft. It landed without any trouble anywhere, any field. The Hurricane was a better gun platform. It was a steadier aircraft when the guns were firing than the Spitfire was. And it was a very stable aircraft, considerably slower than the Spitfire. But it flew well. It was comfortable to fly.
I thought it was a wonderful aircraft. It was gentle to fly, beautiful aircraft. So, very responsive to the controls. And it was the earliest aircraft to be in the Battle of Britain. In fact, most of the Battle of Britain, you hear, like in films and that it was mainly done by Spitfires, but it was mainly Hurricanes because there were more of them. The Hurricane was just an ideal, like a gentleman's aircraft.
By the spring of 1940, the Hurricane had become the backbone of RAF Fighter Command. More squadrons and more pilots flew it through 1940 than any other British fighter type. At the same time, however, a new aircraft was joining operational squadrons. This was the Supermarine Spitfire, destined to be one of the war's greatest designs.
People think of the Spitfire and the Hurricane as being in the same generation. They actually not. The Spitfire is really a generation more in a way, a generation more modern than the Hurricane, although they both use the same engine. But the Hurricane was from the tube and fabric type aircraft, following the previous designs of biplanes by the same designer, whereas the Spitfire was into the all-metal monocoque aircraft, higher performance, very maneuverable. It was very versatile. Bubble-top Spitfires, long-wing Spitfires, short-wing Spitfires. It went through a series of upgrades. It went to the Griffin engine. The speed went up. Everything went up. The Spitfire had a lot of growth to it, and it was an excellent fighter.
Wonderful. It got the height, the speed, a little more speed, and the height. Beautiful two-stage. Stanley Hooker designed it, Rolls-Royce. Beautiful thing. Two-speed, two-stage supercharger. And so all the Spitfire needed was that. And see, it could turn inside both of them with ease. Couldn't roll with a 190, nothing could. The 190 was the best roller in the world, but you can only roll so far.
The Spitfire has an elliptical wing, a very broad surfaced wing. And this creates a tremendous drag if you do a very sharp turn in the Spitfire. This tremendous surface, air buffer surface, gets up against the air that you're trying to propel through, and it really makes the airplane turn sharply. It can turn so sharply that you can black out very easily. The G force of that turn, if you're not knowledgeable about the airplane you're flying, you can put yourself in the black there for a moment or two.
I used to say, I'm going to strap on a Spitfire, and that's the way it is. You are a part of that aircraft. And it's a delightful thing to fly, and you feel a part of the aircraft. It's not strange to you once you know how to fly them, and it's a very, very nice aircraft.
In the air, it was a marvelous airplane. It was beautifully stable. It was very light on controls. It had the standard wing version that I flew had a very favorable stall. It wasn't at all dangerous. And it was a very comfortable airplane to fly.
You don't fly a Spitfire, you wear it. And it's just so comfy and so small and so neat and so compact. It's just a lovely little airplane.
I dearly love the Spitfire. Ask me what I thought of it to fly. It was sheer poetry, just sheer poetry. Terrible on the ground, horrible brakes, but once you got them in the air, it was like flying a poem.
The new fighter, for all its performance, did have some tricky quirks that made it difficult to operate.
On the takeoff and landing, you had to be very careful because it had a tendency to ground loop quite easily, so you had to be careful. On takeoff, you certainly could not push the power to it too rapidly or you just turn right off the runway. And on landing, you had to be ready on the rudder because it could tend to ground loop. And let's say you did a ground run and you pulled up and then you only wanted to pull up so far and you pitched forward, so you've got negative G now. the engine would cut out momentarily. So you had to be careful of that. And also the propeller was fairly close to the ground, so when you were up in this position, your propellers only got about an inch clearance.
While the Hurricane could not hope to match the German Me-109E in performance, the Spitfire's agility and speed gave its pilots an almost equal chance against the Nazi fighter.
The Spitfire pilot, other than when he was inverted, was flying a beautifully balanced, beautifully controllable machine. And when he got in a tangle with an ME, it became a contest of who could wrap around the barber pole the tightest. And the Spitfire always would win because you could bring that spade grip right back in your gut. And you were just shuddering and jaking all the way around the turn like that. And you had to kick it to make it go into a spin. So there you are, just a marvelous, marvelous flying machine.
By 1940, both the Hurricane and the Spitfire were in full production, just in time for the Battle of Britain and their epic moment in the sun, where these two aircraft types and their pilots would play David to the Luftwaffe's daunting Goliath. With the Battle of France concluded, the Battle of Britain began in July of 1940. The Germans, from their bases along the French coast, flung scores of air raids against targets in southern England with one objective: crush Fighter Command and take control of the skies over the English Channel. Only then could an invasion of Britain begin.
The initial German attacks against the British airfields are highly successful. Several of these airfields are severely damaged and put out of commission even, and the losses among the RAF fighter command are extreme and very, very serious. It looks like the Germans are going to win this campaign in the initial days.
Luckily, the Germans made a number of tactical errors. The most significant was how their fighters provided escort.
The 109Es were, of course, they go a little bit higher than the Spitfire. The engine slightly rated a bit higher, and they were lighter. But, of course, Goering made that famous, foolish mistake of listening to his bomber pilots and keeping his fighters all grouped in close. I think that's why they lost it. Galland was dead against it.
But as the fighting raged, Fighter Command's constant hemorrhage of experienced pilots grew critical. To make up for the losses, pilots from the Fleet Air Arm and Bomber Command were transferred into Hurricanes and Spitfires. But these efforts couldn't fill all the holes in the ranks. Out of desperation, the RAF turned to another source for pilots.
Some 200 to 300 Polish airmen, mostly pilots, succeeded in crossing the Romanian border and from Romania to France, where they fought again in the French Air Force, where when France was in turn invaded, and then from France, almost all of them who were alive at the time were able to reach England and play a very vital part in the Battle of Britain.
The infusion of Polish and also Czech pilots helped with the shortage of men to fill the empty cockpits. But if airfield attacks continued, Fighter Command would either be crippled or forced to pull its squadrons back from the coast. Either way, the Germans would have won.
Contrary to many post-war accounts, the Luftwaffe was not fighting a strategic air war in the Battle of Britain, nor should it have. In fact, its objectives were very limited and really centered around gaining control of the air over the English Channel and the southern English beaches. Had they been able to do that for any reasonable amount of time, they would have been able to land an invasion force in England and probably win the war. But as this grand tactical counter-air operation evolved, the Germans lost sight of the objective and drifted away from the effective targets that they had been hitting. Well, ultimately, that drift, that loss of focus, cost the Germans the battle and ultimately cost them the war as well.
At the end of August, the turning point came. a Luftwaffe air raid got lost over England and accidentally dropped its bombs on London. Churchill ordered immediate retaliation. Bomber Command responded by raiding Berlin a few nights later. Hitler was outraged. Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, was embarrassed. Both had visceral, emotional reactions to the attack. For its gall to attack the Nazi capital, England would be bombed flat. London would now be the Luftwaffe's target. Soon, London was being bombed around the clock. The Great Blitz was on.
In London, when the air raid sirens went off, we all dived for shelter. If they started a bomb near where you were, you threw yourself in the gutter. I was at a nightclub with Fred one time when the bombers came over, and you could hear this whoomp, whoomp, and he went under the table. And I said, "What are you doing under there?" He said, "It's better to give than receive." He was being funny. We all had a lot of black humor, you know. You had to. It was the best of times and the worst of times. If you could get away, you went to London, blitz or no blitz. There were nightclubs full of servicemen. Everything was dark. Everything was blacked out. But life went on, and it was a high old time. A lot of young men that had come through the Depression or come off farms were now officers, leaning around on bars, being big wheels, you know. And girls were anxious to meet them. There was a wonderful time, wonderful dances, wonderful things going on. You just dodged the bombs.
Subsequent raids attacked outlying cities and towns as well as London. Pat Ashbaugh remembers one terrible afternoon in Reading.
I was going downtown to meet my young brother, and down the hill, and I heard the sound of an engine. Now, the German aircraft engines had their own particular sound. We hated it. It was terrifying. And I looked up, and just within eyesight there was an aircraft with a white cross on it. Just there. You know, the horrible feeling. And suddenly there's like eggs tumbling out of the sky and puffs of smoke, and I started to run and got down to the town square, and they had bombed this big restaurant that was called the British Restaurant, and it was jam-packed, and it was direct hit, and it was horrible. I met my young brother throwing up in a doorway, and we helped as much as we could.
The London Blitz proved to be a disaster for Germany. The English capital absorbed thousands of tons of bombs, but morale never cracked, and the British redoubled their efforts to carry on the war. Even worse, the attacks diverted the Luftwaffe away from fighter command's airfields. With the pressure off its Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons, the RAF had time to regroup and pour replacements into the frontline outfits. When the Germans returned to southern England's skies in mid-September, they found fighter command reinvigorated and waiting.
If Germany can take Britain out at this point, then they'll be able to focus all of their military power against the Soviet Union, which is what Hitler wants to do anyway. And if they're able to do that, there's a very high probability that they're going to take the Soviet Union out as well before the United States can even become involved in this war and make the difference that it does. So what the RAF is doing at this point is buying time for the whole world, and that time is a luxury that Germany doesn't have.
In 9 days, from September 11th to September 20th, the RAF shot down or damaged 266 German planes, losing only 153 in return. Far from breaking, Fighter Command was as strong as ever. There would be no German victory, and by the end of October, the Battle of Britain was over. Fighter Command had saved England, and thus probably saved all of Western civilization from the jackboot of Nazi terror.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many can help you.
Once the Battle of Britain ended, the Royal Air Force wasted no time in taking the offensive. Initially, small groups of bombers, mainly Bristol Blenheims, formed the tip of the spear and were sent to attack targets in France. Swarms of Hurricanes and Spitfires escorted these fragile craft. These raids, dubbed mulberries, were conducted day in and day out. Soon, the fighting across the Channel became a grim war of attrition. Rod Smith describes how dangerous these missions could be.
We were to go just about straight east, just south of Dunkirk, to give top cover for some Blenheims that were bombing a railway yard or something. Yes, in France, not very far away. Our wing, the claims were by the Germans, very accurate, 15 or 16. 2 for Galland, 2 for Pips Priller, 2 for Munkeberg, or hotshots. It was JG-26, the best German fighter group ever.
Through 1941, these pinprick attacks on the Luftwaffe in France continued. It seemed a costly effort indeed, as some of the RAF's best remaining air leaders were shot down. One of those was the famed Douglas Bader, the legless wonder.
Bader was one of those people. I think he'd been very active in sports. He was a rah-rah pilot and got himself seriously injured in stunting in a plane, in a military aircraft, Bristol fighter, I believe it was. And he ended up having both his legs amputated, and he fought all the bureaucrats and the doctors and everything else to get back on flying status with 2 artificial legs. He was brought into 242 Squadron, and then later on he was commander of a wing and was shot down and damaged one of his legs in the crash and getting out of the aircraft, and it was a real pain in the neck for the Germans, because he kept, even with his artificial leg thing or without artificial legs, he was trying to escape from hospitals and things like this, and they did parachute in a new set of legs for him. The Germans allowed them to do this. I guess some prearranged arrangement. They dropped a new set for him, and he, of course, spent the war in POW camp.
As the sweeps and bombing raids continued over France, air fighting heated up in other theaters. In Egypt, the small Desert Air Force had helped turn the tide against the Italians by crushing their inept Air Force. With only a few squadrons of bombers along with a small force of Hurricanes, the Desert Air Force knocked out almost 1,000 Italian aircraft. The wreckage of Italy's air armada lay scattered across the Libyan landscape. Over Malta, some of the most intense air battles of the war took place.
The island of Malta is the critical point for the British in the Mediterranean theater. Malta is the only option the British have to be able to attack and interdict the Axis supply lines going into Africa. And so hanging on to Malta and making that a base is absolutely critical. And the real problem the British have is, how do you get supplies and aircraft into the island? Because reinforcement is the only way they will win this intense air battle going on over the island.
Getting air reinforcements to Malta proved difficult indeed. In fact, the only way Spitfires could reach Malta was by aircraft carrier.
We were put aboard the Old Eagle. She was slow and short. They had a white line painted down the middle, so you had to keep on. Well, Spitfire, you couldn't see the white line, but if it appeared one way, you had to keep on that to make sure you're going to get your full length to take off. I was signaled off. I got airborne before the bow, and then we formed our 8 up and headed east.
Once at Malta, the pilots were greeted by a scene of modern siege warfare. Bomb craters were everywhere, and the people of Malta were living in caves, basements, or underground shelters. For the Spitfire pilots of Malta, there was no shortage of action. day after day, small forces of bombers covered by massive numbers of fighters droned overhead and were engaged by the gallant defenders.
On July the 24th, we were scrambled to the usual 18,000 feet, and we were in perfect positioning. They were coming in just to the left of our squadron, and we're heading like that, close enough to them. There were 5 Ju-88s, and I took the one who was at my side, you see, and he and I are, this 88 was up close. And here we were slap over, well, just about the northern edge of Malta. Well, we're even closer in than that. It's a small little island, 17 by 9 miles. And I was behind him. I go up to his port engine, fired, and hit him at the port engine, and black and white smoke followed. The flame came out of that engine, and then I just went in through his wing root where the tanks are and aimed for the fuselage. And fire and pieces coming off it, and big pieces. I think the flight was timed for me at 20 minutes. I got on the ground just like that. Well, the 88 got there before I did, of course, but it was burning some miles away to the southwest. Watched the guy in the parachute. I got down long before he did. Of course, I was glad to see him bail out. I didn't want to kill anybody.
For all their successes in the air, however, losses were very heavy. Yet the battle over the island continued, and in the process, many aces were made on both sides. One of those was George Buzz Burling, a Canadian pilot whose marksmanship was utterly uncanny.
George Burling, who is the highest scoring of the Canadian, aces, who made his war record really with the Royal Air Force, because he joined the RAF first and then later came over to the RCF. Everything I've heard from interviewing people who knew him, Burling was probably a sociopathic personality. He had exceptional talents for the job he was being asked to do, but probably was frightening in the sense that he loved it and loved nothing else. That's the more critical element of it, is not just loving it, but nothing else even comes close. So now you're addicted. Now you're all that matters to you. All that mattered to Burling was to go out and fight every day.
The seesaw battle over Malta came to an end at the end of 1942. Though much of the island had been reduced to rubble, the defenders had held firm, driving the Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica from the skies. Again, the Spitfire and Hurricane played the critical role in turning back the Axis tide and changing the course of the war in the Mediterranean. While the Hurricanes and Spitfires of Fighter Command managed to hold off the Luftwaffe during the pivotal years between 1940 and 1942, a newer generation of fighters and fighter bombers were needed to strike back and take the offensive. The Hurricane was pressed into service as a fighter bomber in early 1941. With its massive firepower of 8 machine guns or 4 cannon, it was well suited for the role. But by 1942, the Hurricane was showing its age. Clearly, a new fighter bomber would be needed. The Hawker.
The Typhoon we got on was a different engine altogether. It was a Napier Sabre, 12-cylinder sleeve valve engine, and they were opposed cylinders. You have to feature 2 banks of 6-cylinder engines, like top and bottom. They'd be opposed. 6 on this side, 6 here. Below was another 6 cylinders opposing another 6. They had 2 crankshafts, and all built into a central crankcase and geared. Each crankshaft was geared to the one that drove the propeller. So we had 2,300 horsepower driving the prop. So it was a different aircraft altogether to the Hurricane.
Big and powerful, the Typhoon was initially used as an air superiority fighter, much in the manner of the Spitfire.
Everybody thought the Typhoon was a fighter aircraft. No, it really wasn't. It couldn't turn inside of anything very much. It had its best performance, I think it was 10 or 14,000. At 28,000, you're just barely hanging on. So it really wasn't fit for sweeps.
Hawker Company put out the Typhoon, and that was supposed to be a fighter aircraft, and it could have been, except that it wouldn't perform at altitude where the other aircraft, the fighter aircraft, were. So it was reassessed as a ground-level fighter.
In this role, the new aircraft shined. Down low, the Typhoon was faster than anything the Luftwaffe could pit against it.
I know that I went through the air in sometime spring of 42, maybe it was May of 42, at 422 miles an hour, which was a hell of a speed. Now that's faster than, I think that was the fastest airplane in the world at that time.
By 1944, it had become the best British close air support weapon of the war.
I just thought it was the most wonderful aircraft ever. It was fast, it was big and tough, and delivered a terrific lot of, ammo too. But it was a wonderful airplane, and it was, as far as I was concerned, trustworthy.
Another fighter bomber produced during the war was the Bristol Beaufighter. It soon demonstrated that its versatility made it one of the best all-round planes of its day.
It was the most heavily armed aircraft in World War II. Their side or our side. It had 4 cannons under the pilot's seat, firing forward. It carried 8 rockets. It had 6 machine guns in the wing. And it had 1 firing backwards at the back, and could carry a torpedo or bombs also.
Nevertheless, it was a difficult aircraft to fly.
Once you got a bow in the air, it was a damn fine airplane, but getting one in the air was a very dangerous, hazardous proposition. They were a real pilot killer. And those first 20 to 40 seconds in the air were critical. Once you got past that stage, they were a very, very effective aircraft.
Initially used as a night fighter, the Bow, as its pilots called it, became the Royal Air Force's standard ground attack and anti-shipping aircraft as well. With adequate speed and the ability to carry rockets or torpedoes, it filled all 3 roles to perfection. Bow fighters of Coastal Command carried out some of the most difficult operations of the war by attacking convoys of German merchant ships along the Norwegian coast. Flying at low altitude into the teeth of accurate light flak, the Beaufighter units would rocket, torpedo, and strafe ore-laden vessels and their escorts. It was vital work stopping the flow of raw materials into the Reich, but it was incredibly costly. In the China-Burma-India theater, the Beaufighter excelled as a heavy ground attack fighter. With its long range and heavy armament of cannon and machine guns, pilots could demolish Japanese targets on land and at sea.
It sank a couple of ships. I spotted the first one near Moulmein. Went and attacked it, and we obliterated that ship. So we set out, and by golly, we got over to the just before we get to Rangoon, and there's another one. So we went in and got that one too. And so they were both loaded with Japanese soldiers being relieved and going out into Thailand.
While the Beaufighter earned its fame by being a jack of all trades, it was a master of none. But it was good enough to get the job done until other more specialized aircraft arrived on the scene. Following the end of the Battle of Britain in October of 1940, the Luftwaffe began a campaign of night terror bombing that lasted through much of 1941. At the time, the RAF had pitifully few resources available to counter these nocturnal attacks.
As these German night raids increased, the British began casting about for a solution to them and a counter. And they came up with the Balton-Paul Defiant, which had been a failed day fighter, and they pressed it into service as a night fighter, and it wasn't very effective for a number of reasons. It was too slow, it didn't have radar capabilities, and it just was not a very effective weapon. They also tried other day fighters like the Hurricane, and they guided these day fighters to the target with ground control and with the use of searchlights. But again, these weren't very effective at all. What was needed was some sort of a dedicated night fighter that had radar capability.
With direct interception by converted day fighters failing, the RAF took to intruder raids over the Luftwaffe's airfields in France. The idea behind these missions was to catch the German bombers as they were either landing or taking off. Such missions were originally carried out with the Douglas DB-7 Boston, or A-20 Havoc, as the U.S. Army Air Force called them.
We started on American aircraft made by Douglas. Now, these Douglas aircraft were called Havocs. It was a good aircraft. I must say, I rather liked the Havoc. Now, the Germans had a very unfortunate for them habit of turning on their navigation lights on final approach just before getting to the runway. So you had to hit them then, because before that, having no radar, you couldn't see them. So you could only see them as they were doing this final approach to land. And you were higher and somewhere, maybe not in the right spot. So the speed was of the essence. And when you finally caught up with them, not only were you flying much faster than they were, because they had their undercarriage down, their flaps down, and we were diving from maybe 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher. So the time between when you could fire and collision was extremely short, maybe a couple of seconds at the most. And in those 2 seconds, you had to pack enough ammunition into them to make their suffering on this planet easier, which we did. Of course, the sequel of that was that you were right off the ground, coming out of a dive at high speed, and that's when the fireworks started up. You know, the German airfields were heavily defended by flak and searchlights, all kinds of things coming at you. But it all lasted a very short time because you were traveling at high speed, so you were hard to hit, you were very low, so unless you collided with something, you had a fair chance to get away.
In 1941, the night air war was changed forever when the British were able to install airborne radar sets into the Bristol Beaufighter. With the plane's observer gunner now converted to radar operator, RAF Beaufighters now had the ability to stalk and track targets on their own.
A pilot was given the assignment to take off from an airstrip and go out into the British night, and I would do exactly what they told me to do. I would follow them, just listening to the radio and glued to my instrument panel, pitch black outside. What they were doing was putting me in behind him. Of course, he's changing too. So when they would think I should be in a proper position to detect the bandit on my airborne radar, they would call Smoky One, punch, punch. And immediately my radar observer, listening to that, would turn his set on full gain, and if we were within, say, 8 to 10 miles, and if the bandit were ahead within say, an azimuth sweep of about 10 degrees either side, then he would be able to detect him. And then when we would get to within a distance of where he thought that I should be able to see it. And up until this time, you want to keep in mind that I'm glued to that instrument panel, and I got just as low a light level in the cockpit as possible because I want to maximize my night vision. As I would approach, then he would call out, "Hey, fish, punch, punch," and I would look up. And at that point, I should be able to see the bandit. And if I did, I'd say Judy, and everybody would shut up while I shot. Well, I never did get one, but I saw a couple.
The Bristol Beaufighter was really the first true night fighter deployed by the RAF in World War II. And while it was an evolutionary step in the right direction, it wasn't the actual solution. The RAF needed a fighter that could operate at night, that was easy to fly, had a long range so it could operate in an offensive capacity as well, and the Beaufighter just didn't have those sort of characteristics. Down the road, a new fighter would take its place and eventually replace the Bristol Beaufighter, but it would take some time to get that in the field.
In 1942, a new weapon joined the night campaign. This was the de Havilland Mosquito, one of the war's most unusual designs.
Government threw a lot of cold water on it first because it was built of wood, mainly because it was a non-strategic metal, plus the fact that it was a traditional way that de Havilland had built some of their airliners and racers. Almost every role they used it in: photo reconnaissance, bombing, fighters, night fighters. It was an excellent aircraft. Had good range, good speed. I mean, it didn't need to be defended because it was faster than most of the things that were chasing it.
The Mosquito was a fantastic airplane, as I think anybody that flew it or flew in it would say, without a doubt. I feel very privileged to have been able to fly one.
The Mosquito aircraft, it's been said that it's been the most versatile of all military aircraft that have ever been built. It was used as a night fighter. It was used as a naval patrol plane, hunting submarines. They put a 57 millimeter cannon on board it for sinking submarines. They used it for bombers. It was the most successful bomber built during the war years. It raided Berlin 170 times during the war years, and that is in squadron strength. It carried a 4,000-pound, it's only a little aircraft, and yet it carried a 4,000-pound bomb all the way to Berlin, which is more. Americans couldn't carry 4,000 to Berlin with their fortresses.
Armed with cannon and machine guns in the nose and underside of the fuselage, the Mosquito proved to be a deadly fighter platform. With the navigator turned into a radar operator, the new night fighter could track and stalk German intruders more effectively than any other RAF aircraft, thanks to its amazing agility and 400-mile-per-hour top speed. In fact, the Germans were unable to produce an aircraft fast enough to catch the Mosquito until the advent of the jet-propelled Messerschmitt 262. In the night war, the Mosquito functioned in three main roles. It served as an intruder, replacing the Douglas Havoc in the airfield attack role, and as a night interceptor over England, picking off German intruders. Lastly, the Mosquito functioned as an escort fighter at night. Bomber Command's campaign to destroy German cities was meeting terrific opposition, and losses were prohibitive. To counter the German night fighters, Fighter Command began sending Mosquitoes to patrol the edges of the bomber streams.
What we tried to do at that time, find the edge of the bomber stream, and mind you, they'd be spread out for across 20 miles, and the length of the bomber stream from 4.5 would maybe 60 miles as this whole group's going up. You wouldn't know, we wouldn't know what the targets were or really what their track was. The ground controllers would see them, and they would vector us into the stream and put us on give us the vector of the stream, so we'd be on the side of the stream, and anything that crossed in, we would try to follow. But you'd get in amongst the aircraft, and they would be turning pretty sharply, trying to pick up targets, and it was most difficult. I don't know of anybody there was a few pilots had victories with the German night fighters that way, but it was extremely difficult.
Such escort duties could prove to be very dangerous. Not only was it difficult to tell bomber from Luftwaffe night fighter, if the Mosquito crews dared chase a target into the bomber stream, they were apt to be attacked by their own side.
I got hit by a Lancaster tail gunner one night. I got about a dozen bullet holes out in the wing. And, you just get too close to them. We were doing bomber support, and I never saw him. He was obviously watching me, and I was watching the navigator, watching something else. And as I swung, he was right there and nailed me.
Despite all the dangers, the Mosquito night fighter squadrons helped transform the war in the shadows. Few planes had such a dramatic effect on the war effort. And for the Mosquito crews, their legacy will be one of success and victory. Because the RAF's day fighter forces lacked the range to escort the heavy bombers into Germany and back, they were given new roles to perform. Concentrated into the 2nd Tactical Air Force, the RAF squadrons were assigned to soften up France in preparation for D-Day.
We were taking out the radar stations on the French coast there, Guernsey Island, and those French harbors. And then the V1 sites, we didn't know what they were really, but they called them no-ball targets, and we were going after them. But they were so well camouflaged, you didn't know. So that's what we were doing prior to the invasion.
On D-Day itself, the 2nd Tactical Air Force flew a maximum effort to support the landings, while some units scoured the roads and rails behind the lines looking for Germans to strafe and bomb. Meanwhile, other RAF units attacked targets right ahead of the first waves as they landed on Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches.
Everything was scheduled to the minute. We were to fly over and attack the defenses along the beaches 5 minutes before the barges landed on the shore. So we could see the guys actually getting out of the barges, and and the barges were coming in, they were unloading them, guys heading for shore. And we were the last shot at trying to keep these German gunners' heads down and destroy any guns they had. And there's a building, they show this picture over and over again of pictures taken from a landing barge. And you can see this building straight ahead. Well, our target was a gun just to the east of that building. A built-in heavy emplacement, German emplacement. Unfortunately, we didn't get it quite knocked out, but it helped, So, nothing was guaranteed.
Flying just a few feet off the deck, pilots would sometimes have to pull up to go over tanks and German vehicles.
This is the first low-level attack by 56th Squadron, and when we were all waiting in the dispersal to come back, and great, 4 of them came over right on the deck, you see, and broke away like that. And someone said, just wait till Dougal gets in here, meaning wait for his story. See? Well, sure enough, in he comes. He says, you guys won't believe this, but I'll tell you what, I was flying right down the main street, and I was aiming at this gun placement, and just as I went by, a German jumped out, and I took off his head with my wing. Well, I really thought, oh. So we got the MO, and the MO came along and looked ashore. There's gray brains. Those are brains there on that wing, so he's right. So that's what we call low flying. And Dougal was right. He did knock somebody's head off with a wing.
In the final days of the Normandy campaign, the German army became trapped in the Falaise pocket. Squeezed into a smaller and smaller area, it became a house of carnage as the Typhoon squadrons demolished long strings of retreating Wehrmacht vehicles. Still, the Germans fought back with desperate ferocity.
I was going after some trucks and dove in there, and I got hit by a 20 millimeter. So I was pretty low down, but I managed to get up. And I managed to get out all right.
Captured by the Germans, Younger was force-marched through the Falaise pocket and witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of his fellow fighter-bomber pilots.
The slaughter was something fierce, you know. It was trucks and tanks, half-tracks, everything you can possibly think of, and bodies all over the place, and dead cows. And the smell was pretty grim, too. And like old Eisenhower said, it was the biggest killing ground the world has ever seen, you know. And he said, you know, like he could walk for 100 yards on flesh. So it was a bad place.
The 2nd Tactical Air Force visited incredible carnage on the German army in Normandy, but they did so at a great cost. The German air defense capabilities built into their panzer units and some of their infantry units was just staggering. And as a result, over the campaign in Normandy, just the summer of 1944, 600 Typhoon pilots went down. That's just a phenomenal number, and yet the pace of operations never slacked off. And as the war moved deeper and deeper into France and Holland, the 2nd Tactical Air Force deployed to the continent to operate in even closer harmony with the Army. And through the rest of the war, they were involved in covering every single major operation the Allies launched on the Western Front.
In the war's final months, the 2nd Tactical Air Force suffered one more challenge, the introduction of the Me-262. Over 100 miles an hour faster than the latest Griffin-engine Spitfires, the Me-262 threatened all Allied aircraft. Nonetheless, some of the RAF's most experienced fighter pilots were able to tangle with the Me-262 and win.
Saw it coming, so I swung off to the right to allow myself room to get in behind him. And another guy, flight commander, he didn't swing so far. And when I wound up behind the 262, he was in the way. But his number 2 got in behind it, and he hit it in the port engine. I was almost going to collide with another flight commander, so we had to break off. And lo and behold, the 262 got pretty close to the ground, and then it came shooting up like that, came up to us, like that, almost vertically. So I just pulled in behind it like this, fired, and he caught fire, and he passed me on my right, went down and plunged into the ground.
Resourceful and determined to the end, the Royal Air Force helped drive the Luftwaffe from the skies in the war's final days as its fighter-bomber wings gave the enemy no respite. It had been a long, hard war for the RAF, but thanks to the excellent aircraft its pilots flew, Britain was able to stand against the Luftwaffe and push forward to final victory, shoulder to shoulder with the United States Army Air Force.
The British did the dirty work. They did the grunt work. They were involved in it from the get-go and to the final moments of the Third Reich. And they did it with kids. Their pilots were some of the youngest in World War II. They had 17-year-old guys flying Lancasters, 18-year-old fighter pilots that came and went. You had 22-year-old veterans who'd been fighting since they were 17 by the end of the war. And to me, it is a testament to these young kids that they were not only able to rise to the challenge and endure one of the most brutal sustained air operations in history, but also to emerge victorious.
Saturday, April 7th, 1945, a day of desperation for the last few defenders of the Reich. In the skies above Europe, some 1,200 American heavy bombers paraded overhead en route to targets deep inside Hitler's dying Germany. On the flanks of the gigantic bomber stream, 830 P-51 and P-47 fighters stood a vigilant watch against any marauding Luftwaffe fighters. Recently, the American Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots had little to do as they weaved along with the bombers. The Luftwaffe was a shattered force, long since driven from the skies by the combined might of the American and British Air Forces. In fact, only a few German interceptor units still existed as cohesive fighter forces. All over the Reich, signs of collapse were everywhere. Wrecked aircraft littered the Luftwaffe's few remaining airfields, many destroyed on the ground before ever seeing air combat. Others sat in their revetments, their fuel tanks empty as the fuel crisis reached its climax. Few veteran pilots remained. Those pilots still with their Geschwaders were green kids with hardly any flight time. On the rare occasions they got into the air, they were massacred wholesale by the more experienced Allied pilots. On that spring Saturday in April, thousands of Germans were preparing to give up the fight. Some would stay with their units until the war ground to its inevitable end. Others were slipping away to surrender to the British or Americans, whom they knew would treat them far better than the Russians.
Some of the German pilots who fought to the end were pretty bitter as to how some of their comrades ended the war. And a case in point was a squadron commander by the name of Willy Heilmann. He was on a mission with his squadron, and he went off and landed at an airfield known to have been captured by the British. So a month before the war ended, he basically went in and surrendered by himself. The rest of the squadron and the rest of JG-26 fought on for several more weeks, and his name dropped from the official records very precipitously as a result of that. You contrast what happened to Heilmann with what happened to Erich Hartmann, who was the top ace, really, of all time, and his fighter group. You kind of understand why the Germans could have been a little bitter as to what Heilmann did. Hartmann's group tried to stay together. They actually got their families, and in the final days of the war, tried to get to American lines. Well, through a series of events, they ended up in the hands of a Russian tank regiment. And the Russians surrounded them with their tanks, and then through the course of a night, raped all the family members, raped the children, raped the wives and mothers of the pilots, and forced the German aviators to watch this. And during the night, several of the families later committed suicide because of what was going on, and they realized that this horror was probably going to continue. So one can understand why there was some bitterness towards what Heilmann had done.
Nevertheless, a dedicated corps of pilots remained, taking the fight to the Allies whenever the fuel situation allowed them to climb into their cockpits and get into the air. Their piecemeal, scattered attacks were at best a nuisance to the British and Americans, who by this time could throw over 15,000 aircraft against the Reich's last few hundred defenders. But the Luftwaffe was not going to give up yet. Not when they had one last secret weapon to fling at the stately formations of B-24s and B-17s that brought death and ruin to Germany's cities each day. For amid the ashes, the turmoil, and the chaos of the dying Reich, a new elite unit had been formed for one last-ditch effort to halt the bombing campaign. And on April 7th, 1945, it would go into action for the first and only time in its short history. It was known as Sonderkommando Elba. Based around Stendal, the secret unit had one objective: bring down enemy bombers by any means necessary. If gunfire and rockets didn't work, the pilots had been trained to ram the four-engine behemoths. Each man vowed to destroy at least one bomber or die trying.
General Galland was against it. Even Goering was against it. Some of us rammed on that, but accidentally, but not, we were no kamikazes pilots. And our brass was against it.
We didn't hear anything particular that the Air Force had instructed their pilots to fly, not considering the danger to yourself. But you have to bring those bombers down. Unimportant how you do it, but if it has to be, you have to consider being a kamikaze. It sounded incredible initially when you heard about kamikaze being a method for Japanese. Couldn't convey that or apply that to a European human notion. But if you somehow get familiar with that idea to offer yourself as a whole and fly into something which is your object of shooting down, so be it.
The hope was that Sonderkommando Elba would cause so much damage and shock with their suicidal attacks that Americans would suspend their daylight bombing campaign. Shortly before noon, the suicide pilots took flight. From battered airstrips all around Stendal, 120 specifically modified Me-109s and FW-190s formed up into two groups and turned north. For this mission, their planes had been stripped of armor plating, some of their guns, their radio transmitters, and other equipment deemed non-essential. They would go into battle light and fast to avoid the American fighter escort, then plow their interceptors into the bombers. Most of Sonderkommando Elba's pilots had little actual flying experience. All were volunteers, but few had many hours in the air. Fewer still had received navigation instruction. To fix that shortcoming, the pilots were directed to the bomber's stream from the ground by a controller who repeatedly reminded them of the destruction the Americans had wrought on their homes. Operational fighters. It proved to be a motley collection of old and new. Some squadrons entered the fight with war-weary Messerschmitt 109Gs and Focke-Wulf's 190As. Others possessed later variants, the long-nosed FW-190D or the ultra-fast 109K. Still others whistled into battle with the new Me-262 jet fighter, Germany's last hope to turn the tide of the air war in its favor. Over northern Germany, the battle was joined. The jets of JG-7 and KG-54 waded into the bombers, making swift runs through their formation, cannons blazing.
Somebody would announce that there's a jet coming through, and we'd finally get on them, and I couldn't pick them up till they were down lower from the bottom turret, but they would come screaming down through the formation, and I don't know that I could even track them with the turret because they were going so fast. I never shot at one. There were very few ever came close to us.
We saw them going through in a joining group formation, and they came through faster than anything we'd ever seen. What was that?
We've seen Me-262s, but they were fast. They just flew right through the formations, and they were very fast.
As the Me-262 disengaged, the older 190s and 109s tried to reach the bombers. They were bounced by hundreds of American fighters. Soon, twisting, curling dogfights erupted all over the sky, punctuated by explosions as fuel tanks were hit and demarcated by long trails of smoke as plane after plane plummeted to the soggy ground below. Then the untried youths of Sonderkommando Elba straggled into the fray. Their inexperienced ranks were savaged by pouncing Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Most never even reached the bombers. Unable to dogfight, they simply didn't know how. They were shot down wholesale. But a few of the Raumjägers reached the bombers. They would do their duty. Down they plunged on the American flying fortresses and liberators, their targets swelling in the windscreens. Defensive fire from the bomber boxes scored many hits, sending several of the German pilots spiraling toward Earth, trapped in their burning cockpits. But the gunners failed to stop the remaining men, who smashed their 109s and 190s into the wings and fuselages of their American targets. 8 times these macabre collisions occurred. 8 times the Liberator or Fortress would be torn in half or would explode into a tremendous fireball. 2 more times, bombers were hit but continued to fly, while the Raumjäger went down with his crippled interceptor. By day's end, as the Luftwaffe's few survivors dribbled back to their bases, it was clear that the Germans had at last tasted final defeat. Over 133 planes were lost, along with 75 pilots. Half of Sonderkommando Elbe had been annihilated. 7 of the precious Me-262s were gone. Those who reached home were frequently wounded or burned. Most of the survivors would never fly again. 17 American bombers and 5 fighters were shot down or rammed out of the sky. Far from being the decisive shock that would end the bombing campaign, Sonderkommando Elbe's only mission had been but a spasm in the Luftwaffe's death agony. Only 2 years before this last flight of the Luftwaffe, Germany controlled the skies over almost all of Europe. From the Channel coast to the steppes of Russia, the German fighter pilot ruled supreme. "24 months later, the Reich squadrons lay in crumbled heaps across the length and breadth of the continent, its pilots dead or wounded. This is the story of how this once proud elite corps was so utterly defeated. This is the story of the defenders of the Reich. In 1939, no air force in the world was larger or more modern than Germany's Luftwaffe. Built almost from scratch over the previous 6 years, Germany's Air Force had the best planes, the best equipment, and its pilots were considered the elite of Hitler's armed forces.
The pilots of the Luftwaffe are some of the best of the German armed forces going into World War II. And that's for a variety of reasons. They have a very stringent testing program. They have stringent training standards. And the Luftwaffe has become the premier arm of the German armed forces. And in this way, they have become lionized as kind of the elite of the German armed forces.
Their mission was simple: bring the war to the enemy through terror, tactical support, and Army cooperation. The core of the new Air Force consisted of the dive bomber groups, the dreaded Stukas, and the level bombers, such as the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17. When Germany attacked Poland that September, the Stukas were used to assist the Panzer forces on the ground. Through their pinpoint accuracy, the Stuka could sow destruction upon troop concentrations, bunkers, pillboxes, forts, and other tactical targets. While the dive bombers worked closely with the Wehrmacht, the Heinkels and Dorniers would rain bombs down on the rear areas, blowing up bridges, railheads, road intersections, and airfields. When it was deemed necessary, they could be turned against civilian targets and used as terror bombers to bring a population to 89, then again against Rotterdam, Holland in the spring of 1940. Later, London would suffer a similar fate. It was in the Polish campaign and the subsequent invasion of the Low Countries and France in 1940 that the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots quickly established air supremacy, allowing the Stukas and Heinkels to wreak havoc without fear of interception. By the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe had conquered all. And yet there were troubling signs within the German Air Force even at this early stage in the war. Conceived and developed with such haste in the 1930s, the Luftwaffe was bound to have institutional problems. Most serious of these was a lack of adequate staff work or strategic planning. Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, an unpopular World War I fighter pilot who had become one of Hitler's earliest lackeys, commanded the Luftwaffe with a capriciousness that drove his operational level officers to utter helpless frustration.
Goering was a fighter pilot in World War I who was highly decorated. He received the Pour le Mérite for shooting down over 20 enemy aircraft. He ended up with 22. But the interesting thing about his World War I career was that when he took over the Richthofen-Geschwader a few months after Richthofen had died in action, he really proved that he was not anywhere near the kind of leader that Richthofen was. The guys in JG-1 hated him, and in fact, after the war, they didn't invite him to their reunions because they hated him so much. He was a martinet. He only flew a couple of combat missions and then basically grounded himself so he could pay attention to his administrative duties. So he very rarely flew combat with them. So he was kind of a bloated Prussian egomaniac, even back then. And it only got worse. After the beer hall putsch in 23, he was wounded and he became a morphine addict, and that was an addiction he struggled with through most of his life after that. And he became more and more obnoxious and arrogant and covetous of medals and awards and promotions and titles and recognition. And the pilots in the German Air Force actually referred to him as Fat Herman. They did not particularly like him, especially after the events of the Battle of Britain, where he started accusing his fighter pilots of all kinds of misdeeds. They really became hostile towards him. And even today, they talk about Goering, and they're very, very, very hostile. He was a despicable human being.
Hermann Goering, before the war, was tops, as long as there was no war. In the war, what happened when you were a squadron commander, and every evening you reported how many airplanes you have for the next day. Say you had 16 airplanes, but you had only 10 ready for the next day because those were shot up and had to be repaired. You cannot only report 10 airplanes, no. But they did. They changed it, till it came up to the top. They had more planes as we had, twice as many airplanes as we had flying. That was one thing. And Goering was not a leader.
In the 1930s, Goering's vision of the Luftwaffe had been simplistic and dangerously unrealistic. Basically, he wanted airplanes and lots of them. When proponents of long-range strategic bombing tried to convince the Reichsmarschall to order the production of 4-engine bombers that could carry out the task, Goering refused. 4-engine bombers would take up too much material, he argued, so fewer planes would be produced. He wanted numbers, not strategic bombers, and he could have twice as many twin-engine planes as 4-engine ones for the same cost. The decision would have serious consequences later when his twin-engine terror... It was a war of tactical ground support on a grand scale, and in the early weeks of the war, the Luftwaffe cleaned house. Some 15,000 Soviet planes were destroyed, as were thousands of tanks, trucks, airfields, bridges, railheads, and other targets just behind the front lines. Yet operations were costly, and by the end of 1941, the Luftwaffe was stretched ever thinner as it sought to support the Wehrmacht through the dead of winter.
In the period 1941 through early 1943, as the Luftwaffe becomes committed to a global war, they'll find their assets stretched to the limit. And they'll also begin to feel the effects of the attrition that they are beginning to suffer, starting with the Battle of Britain, the meat grinder that the Eastern Front will become, and in actions in the Mediterranean as they're sent down to stop the convoys coming to Malta, fight in the desert, and then try to evacuate the forces from North Africa. They'll suffer some horrendous losses, especially in their bomber and transport crews. And what the effect of these losses is that many of their most experienced pilots, those that would be part of their training base, have been lost. And so the Germans will have a problem with training replacement pilots. By the end of the war, there'll be plenty of planes to fly, but there'll not be any German pilots to fill the cockpits.
Though the skilled German pilots took a heavy toll of Allied ships and planes, their own numbers were whittled down through simple attrition.
On Palm Sunday in 1943, I'll never forget that, we were escorting 50 Junkers 52, and over there it looked like a swarm of bees waiting for us. We all were shot down. And I made it about 5 kilometers before the beach in Sicily. Then I had to ditch. We lost all the airplanes.
By the summer of 1942, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging on 2 fronts, and replacements weren't keeping pace with the losses.
We never saw anything in the papers about our planes being shut down. And if there were, the number was always so minimal as we were just winning. There was nothing else but winning.
And then a new and far more deadly threat arrived, one that would ultimately doom the Luftwaffe, the United States Army Air Force. That summer, the Americans undertook their first attempts at daylight strategic bombing. The Halpro mission in North Africa kicked the campaign off with an ineffective raid against Ploesti in June. On July 4th, American-flown bombers struck France for the first time. A month later, the legendary 8th Air Force flew its first mission against Rouen, France. These were hardly even pinpricks against the might of the Third Reich, but they were harbingers of the future. One man saw it coming and urged Hermann Goering to take action. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's greatest fighter pilots and leaders, viewed these first raids with alarm. The Reich's own home air defenses were woefully lacking. Most of the combat units were fighting at the front. And since the British were bombing Germany under the cover of darkness, most of Germany's defenses were geared to stopping nocturnal raids. The Americans were coming over in broad daylight, and that would require new fighters and new tactics to stop. Galland's warnings went unheeded. Goering refused to listen. Fighter production lagged behind demand, and Galland's fellow pilots grew increasingly bitter as they found themselves outnumbered in the air.
By the middle of the war, Hermann Goering, who was, for all his despicableness, was actually a pretty intelligent guy. He realized that the writing was on the wall and that Germany was probably going to lose the war. So after being discredited so badly by the Luftwaffe's failures at the Battle of Britain and Stalingrad and the Tunis Air Bridge, he kind of retired. He was still nominally the head of the Luftwaffe, but he basically went into seclusion at Karen Hall. And that caused all kinds of problems because he still was a decision maker. And Galland realized that the only way the Luftwaffe was going to survive was if they increased fighter production immediately. They needed fighters, they needed pilots, they needed to stop the Allied air campaign. Göring refused to listen. He continued to order the production of bombers, especially complicated, raw material intensive aircraft. And by the crisis point of the war, early 1944, the Germans and their industrial base really had not kept pace with the way the course of the war had gone. Galland was this lone voice crying in the dark, and nobody listened.
In the summer of 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign began in earnest. To stop the B-17s and B-24s, the Reich would rely on 4 main types of fighters, 2 single-engine and 2 twin-engine. The single-engine fighter groups flew either the Messerschmitt Bf-109G or the Focke-Wulf 190A. Both could be formidable opponents for the Allied fighter pilots, as the Americans first discovered in North Africa.
We were in Benghazi doing escort for Stuttgart. We were fighting against Spitfire 5 and Hurricanes and P-40s. The Spitfire was more maneuverable, far more than we were. But only we were better in climbing and we could better climb, could out-climb at any time. Then the other thing was we had fuel-injected motors, and they had still carburetor motors. We could do maneuvers which they couldn't do. And P-40s was also a good airplane.
Colonel Fox Raynard, P-40 pilot with the 79th Fighter Group, recalls.
With the P-40 against the 109, the 109 had a higher speed, higher rate of climb, could climb to altitude. We were quite altitude limited with no superchargers. And the one advantage we had over the 109 was that we could outturn them. They could outdive us also, or come close. They were a fine airplane. They a lot of performance. Anytime you were attacked by a 109, about the only thing you could do to keep from getting hit was to get into a tight turn, which he couldn't keep with you. As far as the 190, it was a far better airplane than the 109. As a matter of fact, we had one of each in the fighter group, in the 79th Fighter Group, and I got to fly both of them. The 190 was a Cadillac compared to the 109. It had a nice cockpit, good visibility, had almost a semi-bubble canopy, and all of the instruments and controls were right where they should be. Everything was it was a natural airplane. Good performance. Probably the airplane of the war until the Mustang came along, the Mustang B.
The Bf-109 and FW-190 were designed to be air superiority weapons. Their main purpose, as envisioned in 1939, was to clear the skies of enemy fighters so the Luftwaffe's bombers could do their work. Neither had been built to intercept enemy bombers. When the American B-17s and B-24s began appearing in Europe's skies, both German fighters showed weaknesses in their new role as interceptors. The 109 was sleek and fast, but dainty and not well armed. The G model usually carried only a single 20mm cannon and 2 7.9mm machine guns. With such limited firepower, Axis 109 pilots found it very difficult to shoot down American heavy bombers, which were extremely rugged. Worse, the 109G was a relatively fragile aircraft, not capable of taking a lot of battle damage.
In attacking bomber formations, the 109 pilots had to run this gauntlet of defensive fire from the 50 caliber machine guns. And especially in the rear attacks, this fire was devastating, and many German pilots lost their lives. The ME-109G proved to be especially frail in these attacks and much inferior to the ME-109F that preceded it. It was less maneuverable. Its armament seemed not up to the task of attacking these heavy bombers. There was a heavy frame cockpit which caused it to have poor visibility. Generally speaking, the German fighter pilots considered it to be an inferior fighter. So the Germans will attempt to modify the ME-109G, which is the most produced variant of the ME-109, by slinging 20mm cannons under the wings and pods. And this increase of armament will, in fact, make it much more effective against the bombers. But it will also lower its performance as a fighter. So when American escorting fighters appear over Germany, the ME-109G will essentially become a sitting duck.
Still, the 109 had speed. At 28,540 feet, the Bf-109G-2, with its liquid-cooled 1,475 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine, could just touch 406 miles per hour. It could also race to altitude quickly, an essential asset for any aircraft used as an interceptor. From sea level, it could climb to 20,000 feet in just over 5 minutes. While it could get to the bombers quickly, the 109 could not loiter. It carried enough fuel to stay aloft for only about an hour and a half. That severely limited German attempts to use mass formations against the American bombers, as they frequently took too much time and fuel to assemble. Even with a 66-gallon drop tank, the 109s had only a 250-mile radius of action. Size was another of the 109's assets. With a length of 29 feet and a wingspan of 32 feet, the Messerschmitt had a narrow fuselage and stubby, narrow wings. That made it a difficult target in the air.
And the 109 was a tough adversary. I had one on my tail one time, and I couldn't shake him. I finally did, but they were a good airplane, and almost as good as 51. Not quite. Fortunately, we could outturn them, but contrary to what intelligence told us, we could not outdive them. They informed us we could, but at least the one that was after me, I couldn't outdive. I was going full throttle straight down. But they're very comparable, very good airplane.
Where the 109 was fragile and fussy, the Focke-Wulf was lean and tough. Operational by 1941, the FW-190 quickly proved to be far superior to any Allied fighter of the day. At low altitude, it could outrun anything in the air, including the British Spitfire Mark V. With its phenomenal rate of roll, it could flip over into a split S far quicker than its enemies. Focke-Wulf pilots frequently used the split S to escape from stern attacks as a result. Not until the arrival of the P-51B did the Allies have a fighter equal to the FW-190. Rugged and well-armed, the 190A became the premier fighter in Western Europe throughout the next 2 years.
It was far superior to the 109. Faster, higher, was better climbing, and could go in higher altitude and had more flying time. See, we had only 1 hour flying time. When we, in high altitude, 1 hour and 10 minutes, but it was all. They could fly same as the P-51.
With its 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, it proved to be the only single-engine Luftwaffe fighter that could effectively tackle 4-engine bombers. Its 4 cannon could inflict mortal damage to both the B-17 and the B-24. Later versions of the 190A, which had a wingspan of 34 feet and a length of 29 feet, could carry up to 8 20mm cannon, 4 in the wings, 4 in external gondolas. Such firepower had fearsome effects on Allied bombers. At low altitude, the Focke-Wulf's air-cooled 1,700 horsepower BMW engine could drive the fighter along at about 315 miles per hour. That was fast enough to outrun any Allied fighter of the day on the deck. It reached its optimum max speed at 21,000 feet, where it could sustain 418 miles per hour for short periods. If it had a weakness, it was its high-altitude performance. Above 25,000 feet, the 190 became sluggish at the controls. At any altitude, it couldn't outturn the Spitfire or the P-51, while above 25,000 feet, the P-47 Thunderbolt could turn in sight, as could the P-38L. Turning fights at high altitude usually ended in disaster for the German pilot foolish enough to get into that situation.
The P-47 would outdive anything. You didn't have to worry about shooting anything because you had more firepower than most of them did. And good offense is a good defense. They had a long-nosed 190 that turned out to be pretty good, but there wasn't any of them that really gave us any trouble that I remember. We got a lot of them in the air. We'd go out and get 36 in the air, and some 51 group would go out and get 15 or 20 on the ground. But one time we ran into a bunch of 190s, and I got one, and we got 15 out of 20.
Later on, the 190D became the definitive variant. Dubbed the Long Nose or the Dora, the D model used a liquid-cooled engine and could fly almost as fast as any Allied fighter. The remaining defenders of the Reich in 1943 were the twin-engine heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt 110 and Messerschmitt 410. These aircraft carried awesome arrays of firepower: 20 millimeter, 30 millimeter, even 75 millimeter cannon, heavy machine guns, and even GR-21 rockets.
By mid-1943, the Germans were becoming desperate to figure out ways to break up Allied bomber formations. And so what they did was they took a rocket mortar. Actually, it was basically a mortar shell with a rocket engine attached to it. They called it the GR-21, and they put one in a tube under each wing of their single-engine fighters. And they would go up and they'd take these rockets, and the actual tubes themselves would be angled upwards underneath the wing. Twin-engine fighters, by the way, could carry more than two, but not many more. They would get up, they would fly behind the American B-17 and B-24 boxes, and they'd sit back. They'd have to fire from almost exactly 1,000 meters or 2,000 meters, something like that. There was a precise distance they had to be from behind the bombers. They would fire the rockets. The rockets would go up in this big arc, and if they had fired effectively, they would have dropped right into the combat box and then exploded. And they exploded based on a time fuse. So it was a very, very difficult attack to actually achieve. And trying to lob these mortar shells, basically, with these little rockets attached to them, into American bomber formations proved to be very, very difficult. It was a almost impossible task. But on the occasions where they did actually get the mortar bombs into the formations, they were devastating. They one explosion could take down 2 or 3 bombers. One of the things that the GR-21 did do, though, was it loosened up the bomber formations as the guys tried to get away from these falling rocket bombs.
With the bomber formations spread out, the 110s and 410s would then pounce on the strays, knowing that the defensive firepower the Americans possessed would be more diffused. The heavy fighters made excellent targets, as they were big aircraft and not nearly as maneuverable or quick as the 109s and 190s. As a result, they took severe losses whenever they tried to get in close on tight bomber formations. When American fighters began appearing over Germany, the day of the 110 and 410 came to an end. Neither could stay in the air against the P-47, P-38, or P-51. and they were slaughtered wholesale. Eventually, they were withdrawn and used only as night fighters. When the air war over Germany began in earnest during the summer of 1943, the Americans ran into heavy opposition. As limited as the 109G was as an interceptor, when the B-17s weren't protected by their own escorting fighters, it could inflict heavy losses. Some 109 groups modified their fighters to carry an extra pair of 20mm cannon under the wings, giving them almost as much firepower as the FW-190. The Luftwaffe won the air war in 1943. The interceptor pilots savaged the 8th Air Force's B-17s and B-24s. Those first 12 months of the strategic bombing campaign cost the 8th Air Force an average of 33% of its crews and planes per mission. By October, the Luftwaffe had brought the mighty 8th to a crisis point. Either daylight bombing would have to be suspended, or long-range escort fighters had to be developed to destroy the German fighter force. Long-range fighters were brought in, and that turned the tide against the Luftwaffe. First, the P-38 arrived, fast, maneuverable, and able to stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Lightning became the first strategic escort fighter in Europe. The Germans dubbed it the Fork-tailed Devil.
We knew that we were going to be top support for bombers. And at first we were at Nut Hampstead. We called it Mud Hampstead because that's the way it was. We were all new. In fact, that we were so new that when we went on a mission and we finally did turn our guns loose, they only fired one round or so. And we didn't know what the answer to this was, but they had frozen the oil, just plain machine gun oil, was too thick for the machine guns to reload themselves. So naturally, when we got home, we had to ask the bombers, what do you do? And they says, wash them dry and fire them as long as they will.
Next came the P-51s of the 354th Fighter Group. The 354th arrived in England at the end of November 1943 and began flying combat in December.
When I first went over, not too long after that, we were searching for a name for the group, and we got together as a group and decided on the Pioneer Mustang group because we were the first ones over there.
Able to outmaneuver, outclimb, and outdive every Luftwaffe fighter then deployed, the P-51 proved to be the sword that would slay the Luftwaffe. Soon other units either converted to the P-51 or arrived from the States with the new aircraft. As more and more Mustangs appeared over Germany, the Luftwaffe suffered higher and higher losses. By war's end, 9 of the 8th Air Force's 10 fighter groups were flying Mustangs. The first 6 months of 1944 saw the tide turn permanently against the defenders of the Reich. With the American bombers now supported by swarms of fighters, the Luftwaffe interceptors took to picking off stragglers, bombers who had been hit and had fallen out of formation. Killing the cripples was generally the easiest way to shoot down an American bomber. When not preying on the cripples, the defenders of the Reich had to fall back on fast hit-and-run raids through the weak spots in the American escort screen. They would have time for one pass through the bomber boxes, then they'd dive out of the fight, hoping to live to fly another day. Problem was, there weren't many living to fight another day.
The P-51s, they were escorting P-17s. And that's my P-17, the tail gunner. Well, I didn't even feel it. I just saw the blood running down. Then I felt it. There was this bullet sticking here. I still got it.
During the first 5 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force defending Germany lost almost 100% of its planes and pilots. An average German 190 or 109 pilot by this point in the war lived less than 30 days in combat.
For them, it was almost like committing suicide when they were ordered to get up and fly a few missions. Nobody had any enthusiasm anymore to, I think they were all envious of us that we didn't have to do it. That as long as you are in the military, you take orders and you do what you're told. But we noticed if 12 planes went up, there were always 3, 4 that came down again. They found mechanical trouble, so they didn't have to fly.
Men who survived 4 or 5 combat missions were considered the grizzled old veterans. In fact, by the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter units were almost universally composed of green-as-grass pilots fresh out of flight school, led by a small core group of Experten, long-time aces who did their best to teach the newcomers how to survive. But as the war dragged on through the fall of 1944, more and more of Germany's Experten were being killed while attacking the American bomber streams. With its fighter units on their last legs, the Luftwaffe pinned its hopes on a new wonder weapon, the Messerschmitt 262. As the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262 was supposed to revolutionize the air war over Europe and wrest control of the skies away from the Allies one final time. Powered by 2 Junkers Jumo turbojet engines, the Me-262 could reach 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter then deployed. With its 4 30mm cannon, it could tear apart a bomber with a single short burst. And with a wingspan of 40 feet and a length of 34 feet, it was as small a target as most single-engine fighters.
It was a fighting airplane. It was a good airplane. It was comparably small. Descent, the span was small. The airplane itself was narrow. So it was a size to cope with most of the defense requirements. A small picture of the airplane is harder to shoot at, and especially if that can move fast enough.
Though the Luftwaffe hoped the 262 would be its savior, the new jet fighter had too many problems to be an effective answer to the Allied bombing campaign. Plagued with material shortages, production of the 262 was delayed several months so that it did not see much action until the fall of 1944.
The first one I flew in September 44. You had a guy sitting on the wing and then the cockpit open, and he explained to you what this all is, and then explained what the speed is to take off and what the approach speed is, and say, now go. But he never had to see this.
The Messerschmitt 262 is truly a revolutionary aircraft, but like all revolutionary aircraft, it had some major problems with it. And these were problems that really could not be ironed out given the conditions that Germany found itself in the final stages of World War II. Most importantly, they were running out of raw materials that would go into making the engines. So they were forced to substitute different metals into the engines, which led to turbofan blades breaking and other things like that. The engines were really the weak point in the 262. If you jammed the throttles forward too quickly, they would catch fire. If you abused the engines in any way, they would catch fire. And in the fighter groups, they lasted only a few missions before they had to be replaced. There were lots and lots of little bugs, technical problems that afflicted the Messerschmitt's 262 program from the beginning and were never ironed out, which is one of the reasons why you never see Messerschmitt 262s flying around now, because they're so dangerous to fly. You know, you see 51s flying around, you see Messerschmitt 109s flying. Nobody flies 262s. They're dangerous aircraft. Another major issue was the fact that there weren't any trained pilots to fly the Messerschmitt 262 in training commands. So the pilots that were going into units like Commando Novotny or JG-7, they didn't know how to fly these aircraft. They were revolutionary. They had never experienced anything like it. So it took time to train them, and there wasn't time. There wasn't time, and they didn't receive the training. And so overall, the Messerschmitt 262 was a failure operationally. They lost probably at least as many Messerschmitt 262s in the operational units as they shot down enemy aircraft.
There were tremendous losses involved in the pilot training, and the pilots themselves, the pilots were poorly brought up to facing a war environment. They were not using the airplane to the advantage it had offered initially.
The engines were so fragile that pilots thought they had to advance the throttles very slowly or run the risk of fire or mechanical failure. Consequently, if American fighters caught an Me-262 and it wasn't traveling at top speed, they had the advantage. In those situations, the new jet proved to be easy prey for Allied fighters. Other Me-262s were shot out of the sky by canny P-47 and P-51 pilots whose snapshot accuracy paid dividends.
He started climbing, and so I did, and I just started firing all the way through, and I kind of was firing all the way through when I was going up. And he went by me, and then I kind of fell out into an Emmelman because I'd lost a lot of speed. But I made an Emmelman up there, and then I rolled over like that to see the plane, and I laid down on it, went down again, and took some pictures of it. And so the guy said, well, the guy that got him spun out. I said, no, he didn't. I said, pretty sloppy Emmelman. I said, I didn't spin out. And then Comstock said, is that you, Hotshot? I said, yeah, good for you. So we came home, we were pretty happy. That was the first group. And then they gave a half to another pilot. And I never saw his film, and I don't know how he hit the plane or whether he hit it or not. But I knocked the plane down.
By December, though the Germans were desperately deploying the Me-262, the Luftwaffe had been all but defeated. Desperate for pilots, General of the Fighters, Adolf Galland, began culling men from bomber and transport units to fill the cockpits of an ever-declining number of operational 109s and 190s. Fred Boost, an Me-323 Gigant pilot, was one such aviator caught up in the dragnet.
The transport wings and most of the bomber wings were disbanded. The pilots were sent to Berlin and were asked whether we would become fighter pilots. You couldn't say no. If you said no, you were transferred to the SS armor tank battalions, and that was the last I ever wanted to be. Here came Galland and said, all right, these are the first or the former transport flyers. Now, who of you hotshots does not want to become a fighter pilot? Nobody raised his hand. He said, all right, you'll be fighter wing number 104 in Vienna. I said, sure.
Such men did not last long. With American planes scouring the daylight skies from Aachen to Warsaw and Prague, the Luftwaffe had no safe airspace in which to operate and train its new pilots. Fred Boost's experience was not atypical. In the few months he survived as an FW-190 pilot, American fighters shot him down twice. The last time occurred over his own airfield while he was landing.